All right. Well, welcome to the show, Dr. Mendez. This is such an honor to have you. Really excited about this. As I understand, you're an expert on the Gospel of John, and that really intrigues me. I want to hear your perspective on it and also this course that you have coming up, Decoding the Gospel of John. Really excited to talk to you about it. So, first of all, tell me just a little bit about yourself and how you got into the Gospel of John.
Yeah, so the Gospel of John is one that I have read since I was a child. Like, so many people who, grew up Christian, are Christian. I mean, I'm Greek Byzantine Catholic. I mean, this is, still a gospel that I get to
Yeah.
hear in church with regularity. But it's a very unique experience to take an academic class on it. And there was one class that I took decades ago back in college that really, or grad school, that really changed how I was thinking about the text. It made me want to go deeper into the scholarship on the book. What's so interesting though is now I find myself almost 20 years later as somebody who has actually broken a lot of that scholarship, or is definitely attempting to break a lot of that scholarship. And I didn't really mean to, but there are ways that scholars have approached this particular text over the last half century that I think a lot of people are thinking about reassessing today. And I came up with a very particular new way of thinking through this text. Specifically, I've argued that there's very strong evidence in the Gospel of John and in the related letters of 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John that they might be
Mhm.
pseudepigrapha, that they might be falsely authored texts,
Mhm.
texts that present themselves as having been written by someone that they weren't actually written by. Now, that's not the center of the class that I'm teaching, but it's important because once you begin to, question authorship, dating of a text, origins of a text, suddenly a lot of other questions come to the surface. What does the text mean? What was it doing? What's its essential message? What are its big themes and ideas? How does it fit in its social world? And so a lot of my scholarship has been rethinking everything about the Gospel of John from scratch. And this is a course to really focus on, I think, one aspect of what I do, which I think is really the most important thing, which is to distill what is the theology of the Gospel of John? What is its vision of God, of the cosmos, of human destiny, of the afterlife? And how does that vision get translated into a story of Jesus? One of the central ideas I'm going to bring out in the course is that every action, gesture, moment, miracle in the Gospel of John is actually communicating theology to you.
Do you have any ideas about who may have been the author, or what kind of person this was, their background?
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely tons of speculations in the scholarship about where they might have lived, when they might have lived, all these sorts of things. I work as a scholar, like most scholars today, with the notion that in the end, the Gospel of John is fundamentally the work of one person with a few exceptional chapters. And that doesn't mean that this person doesn't have access to earlier Jesus materials, oral
Mhm.
traditions, or written sources. That doesn't mean that this author isn't reshaping some of those materials. Um, but in earlier generations of scholarship, there was this idea that there were multiple editorial layers, multiple editors that built up the Gospel of John, and that has changed dramatically in the scholarship over the last 20, even 40 years. As really there have been these brand new ways of thinking through how we understand the consistency of language in the gospel, the consistency of
Mhm.
the theology in the gospel, the way that certain motifs are developed literarily across the text and themes. All of this has led scholars to the notion that we're probably looking at one person as at least the ultimate architect of this book. What we
Mhm.
can say about that person is a little harder to really kind
Mhm.
of determine. Um, there are good reasons for thinking that this person is writing around the turn of the 2nd century. So, if you were to give a rough guess, something like 90 to 110. And I say
Mhm.
rough because there are still a lot of pieces of the puzzle missing. But this
Right.
is someone who seems to be writing after the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. This seems to be someone who knows the Gospels of Mark, Matthew, and Luke. And there have been recent studies, mine included, the Gospel of John, A New History, that came out last year with Oxford. Mark Goodacre, The Fourth Synoptic Gospel, is really the best book on this topic. James Barker, Writing and Rewriting the Gospels, that have argued that John knows all three of these earlier Gospels, or the author of John does. And yet, this author has decided to do something very new with that template. I think this author is someone who also knows a great deal about Greco-Roman philosophy, specifically Middle Platonism, and even perhaps more kind of precisely the thought of Hellenistic Jewish philosophers close to connected to the circle of Philo, an ancient Jewish philosopher. I think this is also an author who has read, or perhaps knows at least, of Pauline teachings. And so he's someone who knows Paul, the Apostle Paul, and he seems to be in many ways drawing influence and inspiration from some of the ideas of Paul. He might have been living in Palestine. It's clear at the very least that he's writing somewhere in the Greek-speaking Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, probably. So there are little clues that we try to put together to understand who he is, but there are a lot more mysteries than not.
Yeah. More questions than answers. Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess one of the reasons why I'm assuming you would reject the Apostle John as the author, traditional authorship, is because, number one, he's Greek speaking and also very familiar with philosophy, which I guess likely the Apostle John would not have been. Is that kind of the reason?
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely part of the picture. Coupled with some other things, right? So the traditional idea that the Gospel of John was written by John, the son of Zebedee, is certainly difficult to square externally with an author that, yes, seems to be very steeped in philosophical currents, also who seems to be very literate. Most ancient Greek speakers did not have the ability to write a book of the size, magnitude, scope, and sophistication of the Gospel of John. I kind of give the analogy of, literacy is a scale, right? So, I have a wonderful, son. He's less than 10 years old, right? He's a little kid still. He can write a storybook about a kitten. He can, do a kind of story about, but he can't write the Gospel of John. He can't write Shakespeare. When he was 4, he could write his name and maybe write a few words, but he definitely couldn't do more than that. In the case of John, the son of Zebedee, this is a person whom the earlier Gospels present as a Galilean fisherman, which we know was a profession that did not receive literate educations. Even if they could read tiny snippets, in their native language, Aramaic, let alone Greek, even if they could write little snippets of Greek, they're not really ready to take on a text of this sophistication. But there are even more reasons to think that this is probably not John, the son of Zebedee. Some of the reasons would include, for instance, the fact that we know quite a bit about John, the son of Zebedee, from earlier Gospels. We know that he was called while fishing with his father on the Sea of Galilee. We know that he saw Jesus transfigured on a mountain. We know that he had a special day where he tried to ask Jesus to sit on his right hand and was rebuffed. We know about a time that he went into the Garden of Gethsemane on the night before Jesus' death and saw Jesus in a special way that only two other disciples had the chance to see Jesus really suffering in the pain of the moments before his arrest. All the stories that we find that have John in them in the Synoptic Gospels don't appear in the Gospel of John. And so it is really interesting to think, well, if this is that same person who's supposed to be an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, who's supposed to be precisely this eyewitness to the life of Jesus, why does he omit all the stories that are associated with that specific eyewitness? It would seem like we would have had that testimony. There's one other final detail. I'll note that in chapter 18, verse 15, it is said that the other disciple who's with Peter was known to the high priest in Jerusalem. Literally, truly, the most important Jewish person of his time, the high priest. In chapter 20, verse 2, it's very clear that the other disciple who is with Peter is the disciple whom Jesus loved, who is supposed to have authored this book. He claims to author the book in chapter 21, verse 24. You also
Mm.
get that hinted in 1935. Would we really expect that a Galilean fisherman would be a person who would know the high priest personally? So people have thrown out lots of other options for who might be the author. You'll hear people say that, for instance, this could be another John, another person by the same name. John was a pretty common name in the ancient world, still today. Some people speculate it could be Lazarus. Some people think that it could be another unknown disciple. Some people think this could be merely a literary character that was created for the book, kind of a historical fiction through the eyes of someone who was with Jesus. There are lots of different ideas. We don't really cover that necessarily in the course. In the course,
Right.
what I focus on is the importance of this character for understanding the symbolism of the Gospel of John.
And from what I gather, you're also going to be discussing, some misconceptions that people have about the Gospel of John. Tell me about some of the common misconceptions that people have and maybe why they have them.
Yeah. I mean, I would say that probably the first misconception that everyone needs to break about the Gospel of John is that they know what it's talking about. The Gospel of John is something that we sing, chant, read, preach on in churches all around the world. And we know its expressions, born of spirit, children of God. All these expressions are ones that we're so familiar with that we're almost too familiar with them. We don't fully understand what this would have meant, what this would have sounded like to an ancient reader. People in the first century, second century, reading a text like the Gospel of John, or reading the Gospel of John specifically, would have heard different things from these phrases. They would have tied to concepts in Middle Platonism and Hellenistic Jewish philosophy that would change how they would approach this text. They were swimming in an entire soup of theology that is different from what we swim in 2,000 years later, even though, our soup is based on that one, right? Yeah, leave wine in the cellar, it'll age over time. And so I think we have to break that assumption that even though we know the Gospel of John, that we really know the Gospel of John. But I would say there's one other big misconception that is really critical to break, and it's going to be at the center of the course that I'm teaching. And that's the idea that John is fundamentally a revelation of who Jesus is. It's very common to hear people, even scholars, say that, John is a text that tells you that Jesus is divine. Right at the beginning, it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, divine, something like that, however you translate theos there. And it's true that on some level, the Gospel of John is a discussion of the life of Jesus, is definitely drawing you to appreciate the fact that Jesus is divine according to the Gospel. But that's half the story, and only half the story. The other, more profound notion that is absolutely central to the Gospel of John is the idea that Jesus, who as God is spirit, according to chapter 4, who is immortal, who is divine and called God right at the beginning of the book, came to earth so that human beings may become spirit, may become immortal, may become divine. Chapter 1 presents Jesus as the Son of God, precisely with the end that, as chapter 1 also says, humans may become children of God, that they might share in a subordinate, participatory manner in the divine attributes, the divine traits of God, that they might be divine, small g gods themselves, not distinct from the one true God that the Gospel of John proclaims, but in a way that actually draws life and divinity from that one being. They are deified. This is an idea that's really important in Christian history. It's one that early Christian writers are going to develop. It's one that's going to shape the Catholic and Orthodox traditions in later centuries. It's one that is extremely important in the Gospel of John. And if you don't see that vision of human beings becoming divine in the Gospel of John, you're never going to be able to understand the logic of Jesus's speeches and also, more importantly, the logic of Jesus's actions and gestures. Because the miracles he does in the gospel, the other things he does in the gospel, where he goes, what he does, all are meant to reflect symbolically that central teaching that Jesus is the celestial man who creates celestial humans. He is the God who creates divine humans.
So, in other words, I guess it's more about theosis than it is who Jesus is as a person.
As in, maybe both, or maybe better said, the teaching of Jesus being divine is the setup for the teaching on theosis. It's,
I see.
in other words, what the gospel spends all of its time saying and teaching about Jesus is important, not merely for what that says about Jesus, but for how that also will explain what humans will become. And so that's really the kind of through line.
Yeah. So I'm curious on the question of miracles.
Mm-hmm.
You're going to be covering this extensively, I would expect, and talking about, I guess, the nature of these miracles. Look, there's kind of been this huge debate. I even remember this homily from Pope Francis where he was talking about the multiplication of loaves, and I think he understood it as, a lesson in sharing, right? And so there's kind of been this debate on, are these really historical miracles, or are they meant to tell us something spiritual in nature? I suspect you're going to be tackling that, right?
In this course, I leave it open to listeners, viewers to kind of just, leave it for themselves to decide how they want to approach the miracles. If they want to approach them as real historical things, or as, purely kind of more fictionalized stories that might be communicating a deeper spiritual truth. There are definitely different scholarly opinions on that. And, I've worked on my own opinions about how we should approach the miracles in John. But I think that, in mentioning how Pope Francis is reading the Gospel of John, which is this very ancient Christian way of reading the Gospel of John, we see it in Origen, we see it in lots of early Christian writers. Yeah, I think the question of the miracle itself, the kind of literal historical layer of the miracle, isn't actually the most important one. What Christian writers for 2,000 years have found more important are the deeper hidden meanings and symbols in those miracles. And I think that that's what's going to be central to this course, that irrespective of whether you believe in this gospel or not, whether you believe miracles are possible or not, the big point is, what did the author of John want to communicate through these stories? And if you look closely at the stories, all of them, even the ones you might think are minor, even the ones that you might think are mere transitions in the book, I argue really represent central themes in the Gospel of John. So, for instance, if you take the very first miracle in the text, the transformation of water into wine. Jesus goes to a wedding. He, is told by his mother that there's not enough wine to go around. And Jesus, after kind of a moment, hesitation, delay, rebuff, decides to secretly go and, have 6 jars of water filled, and to go ahead and turn that water into wine. That story on the surface looks like Jesus doing a very kind act, apparently, for a lot of people who really need their party to keep going. But there's something deeper happening in that story. To understand it as merely water turning into wine, a party trick, is missing the whole thing. The real story at the center of that miracle is that Jesus, in a secret, hidden manner, intends to transform humans born of flesh into spirit. And what you're going to see is that the language that story uses to describe the transformation of water into wine just so happens to be the language Jesus uses in the next chapter to describe the transformation of flesh and blood human beings into spirit. And so it's a symbol of something larger. This happens again and again in the book.
So typology, in other words, kind of looking at the spiritual sense, I gather.
In essence, yeah, I think the author of John is someone who, was writing in a culture where allegorizing ways of approaching biblical texts were extremely
Hmm.
common. If you read
Right.
Philo, if you read Josephus, you'll
Right.
see them, say things like the entire Torah is to be understood allegorically. You certainly see early Christian writers like Origen
Oh yeah.
read the, Hebrew Bible Old Testament tradition, but then also New Testament texts allegorically.
Yeah.
I think that the author of John is someone who was very accustomed to reading biblical texts allegorically. And, he framed his own text biblically, right? Just as it says in Genesis, in the beginning was, God created the heavens and the earth. John begins with, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and He created all things. He wants you to think of John as a text that has a kind of biblical flair. And because of that, I think he's already set it up to be a text that has deeper allegorical symbolic meanings that are
Mm.
pretty obviously exposed the moment you know what you're looking for. What you're
Hmm.
looking for are the key terms, the key phrases that structure John's theology. So, what we're going to do in the course is we're going to look at the Gospel of John and we're going to understand its theology and the specific words and phrases the author uses to encapsulate the key ideas of his theology. And then we're going to reread the book and see how those phrases work in the miracle stories and how they progressively essentially leverage the miracle stories and some other stories that aren't miraculous at all. Stories of how Jesus relates to his brothers, stories of how he, will take a siesta in a, kind of a more rural area, and how they all tend to refract the theology of John. They're all vehicles to communicate the central idea at the heart of the book that Jesus is a divine being who came to make humans divine.
And I know we're up against the clock here, so I just had to sneak this one in because you've mentioned the prologue of John multiple
Yeah.
times there. Some scholars have speculated that this is some kind of later addition to the Gospel of John. Sounds to me like you would argue that it's actually original. Is that correct?
Yeah, this is something that's moved quite a bit in scholarship in the last 20 years. By the way, if you're listening to anything that I'm saying and it all kind of seems a little different from perhaps what you learned in a college class 40 years ago, what you read in a book 30 years ago, and it's because there's been real changes in the scholarship as we've been able to understand and recover more of I think the backgrounds and contexts of the Gospel of John. But
Mm.
I stand with the majority of scholars today who really tend to think that chapter one is probably written by the same hand as wrote the rest of the gospel. Um,
Hmm.
One of the reasons why scholars had thought otherwise is, for instance, chapter one has this discussion of Jesus as the logos, the word that doesn't appear in the rest of the text. But one of the things that scholars have now, really been able to see, especially in the last 10 or 15 years of scholarship, is that actually the emphasis on the words of Jesus seems to be directly tied back to this chapter one. That there's really a reason why we keep finding this motif later. It's part of the, if you will, structure, deep structure of the book. More than that, we have noticed that the language of the prologue and the language of later chapters is very consistent overall. The central
Mm.
themes that we find, the motifs that we find, the literary execution around all of these passages works, the eyewitness claims. And
Hmm.
so I don't think that every single passage of the Gospel of John might have come directly from the hand of the person that would have been the ultimate author. But I do think that chapter one, with most scholars today, is actually one that we need to consider to be perhaps a little different from the rest of the text. It's a framing introduction, but it's one that is meant to introduce you, orient you, center you to read the text that follows.
Yeah, yeah, and I can certainly see how there's a lot of the themes in the prologue that line up with what you're saying here, with the rest of the Gospel of
Children of
John. That makes
God,
sense.
yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly, exactly, in the concept of theosis. So, you also mentioned the dating of this book earlier. You said I think 90 to 110 or so. Where would you put it in personally? Would you put it in the second century or first century?
Yeah, I that's a really great question, and any certain answer is wrong. I mean,
Right,
there's kind of no other
exactly.
way to do it.
Yeah, right.
Um,
Yeah, there's no way to be sure.
yeah, I mean, I tend to think early second century makes a good
Mhm.
amount of sense, and it has to
Yeah.
do with the fact that I think the Gospel of John knows the Gospel of Luke. And there are a lot of Lucan scholars who increasingly are interested in dates for Luke that would put it in the first decade of the second century. And
Right.
so that could suggest that the Gospel of John is written, if you potentially suggest maybe a couple years later, really, you don't need that long.
Sure. Right.
But that could suggest that second century dates are to be preferred. But there are still so many questions about the dating of Luke. And
Yeah.
so there are so many questions about the dating of John.
Right. And you're right. There's no way to be dogmatic on these things.
Yeah, the
There's no way
moment
to
you
know for
ever
sure.
see a specific date, it's the moment you
Yeah.
know that person has to be wrong. Or you could think of it the other way, right?
Yeah.
One of those dates has to be right because we've tried them all.
Right. Well, wonderful. I'm really looking forward to the course Decoding the Gospel of John. I'm going to have a link to it in the show notes where everybody can go and sign up. And also, where can they go to learn more about you and your material?
Yeah, so please go visit my website, hugomendez.com, where it really has, all of my publication kind of record and links to relevant things, some free articles that you can access, some of my media appearances on History Channel, things like that.
Oh,
But more than that, go out and get the book. The Gospel of John: A New History was published by Oxford last year, and it's going to be, in many ways, a kind of central book that frames this course. The beauty of the course, though, is that if that book feels, maybe a little too advanced for you, you're going to hear me do it or talk about it in the way that I do with my own students. I'm going to break it down from the beginning, simple language. I teach students here at UNC Chapel Hill who come from all walks of life, all backgrounds. They're atheists, they're Buddhists, they're Hindu. And, we really get into this text on a very deep level. But, we start from basics. And so maybe that might be the right way to do it. Another great feature of this course is that every class session will end with Q&A. And so if there's that question you're itching to ask, it's, not very common to have the ability to ask the author, ask the teacher,
right.
this kind of a question. And so this is going to be a great opportunity for people who really want to get deep into the Gospel of John, even if they might find it intimidating. If you're a pastor, lay person, Christian, please join.
Yeah, really excited about this, and also just curious, what did the History Channel interview you about?
Oh, I
I
know.
just
I've
have to know.
done dozens of episodes for
Oh,
History
is that right?
Channel.
Okay.
I've done things with Discovery. So yeah,
All
no, I,
sorts of
I kind of
things.
have a
Wow.
whole little career out
They
there.
usually
And
have an interesting spin on these topics, so I was curious.
yeah, well,
Anyways, yeah.
I tend to do
Go
things
ahead.
in ancient religion or ancient
Yeah,
history broadly, but
nice.
History Channel will take you different places. It's
Yeah,
fun.
they really
Yeah.
will. Yeah, I love it. Thank you so much for coming on. It was an absolute honor, Dr. Mendez. Love to have you back on.
Yeah, please. Thank you.
Thank you.